Hi, everybody. It's Larry Kotlikoff back with another podcast from Economics Matters. I'm delighted today to have a guest that is also a very dear friend, Peter Fox-Penner. Uh, Peter, I have some part of your bio here, but not all of it. So I'm going to ask you to fill in some of it after I say a few words about you that I know that are written online. So Peter is a former the founder and former director of the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy and a professor of practice at the Boston University Questrom School of Business. He's a partner and chief strategy officer of Energy Impact Partners. This is a dedicated clean energy private equity fund that he helps lead up. He's on the Global Leadership Council of the World Resources Institute, on the advisory boards of Mobility Impact Partners, the National Regulatory Research Institute's Training Initiative, and PACE, P-A-C-E. He's also affiliated with the Energy's Futures Initiative. Peter formerly served as a senior official at the U.S. Department of Energy, and he worked in the Clinton White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And prior to BU, his main career has been principal and chairman of the Brattle Group. It's an economics consulting firm. It's not as well known as perhaps McKinsey, but at least among those who know of consulting firms, the Brattle Group is a major player. So being the principal and chairman of that company is a big deal. Now, Peter's also a frequent speaker on energy topics. He's the author of numerous articles and books. One of these includes the highly acclaimed book, Smart Power, Climate Change, the Smart Grid, and the Future of Electric Utilities. That was published in 2010. And today we're going to talk about his new book, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2020, and it's called Power After Carbon, Building a Clean, Resilient Grid. Here's the book. Here's a picture of the book. Peter's very influential in the world of climate policy, grid policy, electric power strategy, regulation, governance, sustainable finance, the relationship between public and private economic activities in this space. And the book is really a marvelous analysis of where things stand, not really about climate change, but really about how, if we can get control of carbon, how we can if we can move to clean energy, how we can actually deliver the clean energy in a way that works for everybody, given the potential rise in the demand for and need for clean energy. But Peter, let me start by asking you to kind of supplement what I just said by telling us. I'd like to have our guests talk about their career paths, because we have a lot of young people listening to these podcasts. I think it's inspirational for people to hear how you went from, like everybody else, like all of us, went from, maybe 7 pounds and 10 inches to being 5'11", but having done all these remarkable things and continuing to do remarkable things, including writing this truly fantastic book. It's fantastic because it's full of really fascinating facts, but it's also extremely well written. It's really telling us so much about what we can and can't do, or what we need to do to fix our climate problems. But tell us about, your path from childhood through, college and getting into the White House, and what it was like to work there, and where things evolved from there.
Well, first of all, thank you for all those kind words, Larry. And it's a pleasure to be with you on the program. A few quick corrections just on the bio. I've transitioned from professor of the practice to senior fellow. The Institute for Sustainable Energy is now the Institute for Global Sustainability at BU. We're expanding its focus, really great. I've become Chief Impact Officer at Energy Impact Partners, focusing on carbon measurement and ESG and a lot of policy issues. And I continue to be now a senior advisor at the Brattle Group. Cool. I'm certainly not going to talk about how I evolved from a child into the person that I am, but I will say a few things about my career path that may be of interest to your listeners and viewers. I've always been interested in making positive social change. I sort of came of age in the 60s, and that was really the only life mission I ever considered. And what's interesting is that I've sort of migrated from one, you might say, change-making profession, which was originally engineering, actually, in college. Then from there into economics, and from there into government, and did a lot of consulting on the way, and then have ended up in finance, you might say, the financial sector. What I have learned through that path is that all of those realms contribute each in their own way to making change. And I think I sort of made the mistake of thinking that I was going to find the one that dominated all the others. And instead, what I found is just the opposite, which is that they're all relevant. And as a result, I try to live in it, as many at once as I can, which is a crazy way to proceed with one's profession. But it is, I think, interesting to see that I really respect each one, and I don't think one dominates.
So okay, let me make this more precise. So you grew up in the Chicago area, right?
Yes, in Chicago.
And then you went to college. Where'd you go there?
I went to the University of Illinois Engineering School.
Okay, so you got an engineering degree. And then what was your first job out of college?
I worked at the Governor's Office of Consumer Services in the state of Illinois, which was really a early utility watchdog agency.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you had this kind of maybe accidental connection to the world of energy through this path. I think that's kind of interesting that a lot of people's careers end up happening by accident, or maybe by fate, or something draws them to that particular area. But okay, so you're in this utility, working for the governor's office on utility, I guess, regulation. And then what happens next to Peter Fox Penner? What's the next step?
Well, I had an engineering background, which helped quite a bit in understanding utilities, but I didn't understand economics or finance. And I really felt that I couldn't really address what was going on in the energy sector without knowing more about those two subjects. So then I went to economics graduate school, got an economics degree.
And where was that?
At Chicago, the University of Chicago. And then I finished my education, and from then went from consulting to academia to government to finance. And evolved through all of those, change-making professions, you might say.
Uh-huh.
And I've come to really, really like them all.
And tell us about your stint with the Energy Department and the White House. What was that like working in the government?
Absolutely fantastic, unforgettable, and I highly recommend it. The Department of Energy, I think, for a long time, up until recently, kind of had a bad rep as a rather sleepy agency that didn't have enough budget or statutory authority to do very much. It was largely an R&D agency, and really spent more on protecting our nuclear weapons arsenal, which was part of its original mission, taken away from the Defense Department to enhance civilian control of the military, and also to do basic science research, which it still continues to do, really, as a leading global enterprise in that field. But it wasn't doing much in energy historically, and it didn't have the kind of authority that even state utility regulators have, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission had. So I was a little bit afraid when I got a job there that it would be a sleepy place, and I couldn't have been more wrong, because it really it has a vantage point across the entire energy sector, every part of the energy sector, and no one else in the United States has that much perspective, that ability to bring stakeholders together, that ability to see what's needed in the way of research and development and things like that. And since then, the Energy Department has, I think, really grown substantially, is particularly grown under Obama and then Biden, to be a much stronger, better funded agency that's now really at the core of our climate policy since the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act.
And so, what was your kind of life like? Just give us a couple of words about, what was life like working on a daily basis? Were you going to lots of meetings with top officials, the energy secretary? How did you transition over to the White House? I guess you were working in the West Wing for a while. Am I right on that?
Well, technically, in the Eisenhower office building next door to the West Wing. What used to be called the old Executive Office building. Now it's the Eisenhower building.
Right.
I was at Science and Technology Policy, which is located in that building.
If anybody gets to get in there, I worked there too, and as a young economist with the Council of Economic Advisors, it's the most beautiful building. Fantastic black and white tile floors, just like the Treasury is fantastically beautiful building. People don't think about visiting those buildings when they go to Washington, but if there's a way to do it, it's definitely worth it. But anyway, go ahead. So you work with President Clinton directly?
Well, rarely did I see President Clinton at events and things like that. I worked more closely with Vice President Gore, since Science and Technology Policy really kind of reported up to him effectively, and mainly worked with his staff, who I thought were fantastically talented people and remain friends to this day.
Cool. So let's move over to your book. Okay, let's start with again. Here's the picture. You can buy it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or Indie Books,
or from your local bookstore.
Your local bookstore. I was just getting to say that's the most important place to buy it from, because we need to have more local bookstores, and get them to come back for sure. But Peter, you have this interesting title, Power After Carbon. How did you come up with that title? and then give us give us like the elevator pitch on what the book's covering. Then we'll get into
Well,
the details.
the book is about whether we will be able to create a power industry, I'll call it, or power ecosystem that no longer emits greenhouse gases, primarily carbon. And that's really what the book is about. In a little more detail, the book asks, first, it's in three big parts. The first part is, how much electricity are we going to need in the future, where we do have an energy system that allows us to stay safe, no longer contributes to dangerous climate change? So the first part is, how much electricity are we going to need in this safe climate future? The second part's about what I call the big grid, the large scale grid, and how much of that power we'll get from local sources versus faraway sources. And the third section of the book is about business models. Because I didn't just want the book to be about technologies. I wanted to make everybody understand that this isn't just a technological question. In fact, I don't even think it is primarily a technological question. I think it is primarily a financial and institutional question. That is, the most important changes are financial and institutional to get us to a safely decarbonized future.
Okay, so tell us, you have all kinds of interesting shockers here. For example, you say that the 8% of the Sahara Desert, the solar panel, if we had, I guess, solar panels on 8% of the Sahara Desert, they would suffice to power the entire globe. And that, so that's so maybe as you're talking about the book, you can kind of intersperse many shockers that I was coming across. But this brings me to the issue of the grid of moving to much more powerful electricity lines that would span at least certain countries, if not connect across countries, connect across the world. And I think you talked in the book about DC electric lines versus AC lines being far more efficient. Let's talk about the U.S. Can we build a new electrical grid system? We're talking here about the big grid, not the microgrid or small grid that you're talking about as an alternative here. But you're saying that we're going to need some reliance on transmission of electricity across the country or across parts of the country, because not every part of the country has the natural resources to produce green energy. So, but you're saying that in the book, if I'm reading it right, that we have a highly inefficient system, highly decentralized, all kinds of different actors involved in regulating or determining whether you could, for example, build new power lines across state, even across within a state, across county lines. You have one chart or table in your book, in the middle of the book, which shows all the different sign-offs of all the different just federal agencies that would be required to build new high-powered power lines. So talk to us about that. I mean, can we get to the power without carbon world that you're talking about without these kinds of power lines being put in place? And is this like bureaucratically impossible in the U.S.? Maybe it's possible in China or even the EU, because you suggested that more progress might be made there. but it seemed like it's almost impossible given all the constraints that you were outlining. This is the Peter Fox Penner that I know and love, who on the one hand is incredibly optimistic about the future, on the other hand is always kind of saying there's a but, because the but is not likely. So where are you on this?
Well, let's start with some important first principles. As you alluded to, there are a lot of solar resources available to most of us. With lots of sun falls on the Sahara Desert, but lots of sun falls on most cities in the United States. And there's a table in the book that talks about the percentage of electricity each city could get from the sunlight falling on it. All of the available rooftops in that city. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory has done some very, very clever and I think careful research to answer that question. And you get numbers like 8% in Boston, which doesn't have a lot of roof space compared to the amount of energy it needs, and 50 or 60% even in some very sunny, spread out cities like Phoenix. So we can get quite a bit of the clean carbon-free electricity that we need locally. And within the bounds of economic cost effectiveness. That is, we shouldn't be doing it where it's extremely expensive because the roof faces in the wrong direction and you really don't get very much solar energy out by putting a solar cell up. So that's not a good use of our scarce capital and time. But where it's cost effective, we should be, and I think we will be, using the vast majority of our local solar resources. And now we're starting to even maybe get some local wind. And for all of those resources, there are great benefits in resilience, and because they're nearby and you don't rely on lines that come from far away. And they build community economic activity, give great jobs inside cities where we need them. And there's a lot of reasons to use all that resource. But what I conclude in the end of section 1 of the book is that that's not going to be enough to get us to a decarbonized future where we need to probably at least double the amount of electricity that we're making in order to have enough electricity for electric automobiles, pretty much 100% of our personal cars, I think, or close to it, and lots of industrial processes.
We're talking doubling by 2050 when you...
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Lots of research shows that a reasonable estimate is doubling by 2050. And that, by the way, reflects a lot of energy efficiency investments, which are also extremely important to make. It's the cleanest kilowatt hour you will ever use is the one you don't use at all. That's an old saying from the early days of energy efficiency. And it's really true. And energy efficiency is the largest resource. If you look historically at what we haven't used, it's a lot. The energy we have saved is larger than any single resource that we rely on. So energy efficiency is very, very important. Distributed energy is very important. But when you do the realistic max of those two, section 1 of the book concludes you're still going to need to roughly double, or at least just plus 75% of large-scale sources delivered with large lines. And so let me pause there, because that's a key inflection point in the book where you transition from section 1 to section 2. And then in section 2, you start to say, okay, how are we going to, roughly double the large scale capacity having maxed out our distributed gen and our energy efficiency, and that's sort of part two.
Oh, okay, so part one, you're saying, can we actually get to can we get to your, to carbon independence with a doubling of the electrical needs, let's say in our country, without these large lines? And are the large lines feasible? I mean, in terms of or do we need a huge campaign to make clear to the public that this is paramount, that this is absolutely essential, and we're not going to? And is there anything in the new Inflation Reduction Act that will lead us to that solution, to these high-powered lines?
Yeah, the answer is yes, but if you will, let me get to that. We to roughly double the size of the grid again after we're doing everything we can on efficiency and local or distributed generation, or even if it's plus 50%.
Mm-hmm.
We will have to build more lines, as well as use the lines that we have as efficiently as we can by putting technology on them that allows more current to flow on the wires we have, or reconductoring them, to use the technical term, to allow more electricity to flow. But we're going to need to build more lines, and a significant number of additional lines. And as you point out, the United States has a uniquely poor track record amongst almost all OECD nations in planning and getting permits for and building large-scale transmission, particularly recently. From the 1930s to the 1970s, the energy crisis, and even maybe as late as 1980, we were building quite a lot. I mean, we doubled the size of the power system every 10 years for 4 decades, Larry. So that was a lot of plant construction and a lot of line construction. But we slowed down a lot in the 1980s, partly for good reasons. In the 1980s, we discovered energy efficiency, our largest resource, and electricity demand stopped growing at this torrid 7% a year and kept growing more slowly, to the point where in the decade that just passed, it hasn't grown at all. So energy efficiency, and to a much lesser extent, local distributed generation, has actually brought down electricity use unbelievably. And that's been a good thing. But now we need to bring electricity use back up again and restart our building campaign for a very different reason, namely to combat climate change. And so we're having to kind of get back into building lines when, in the intervening decades, we really didn't modernize any of our planning processes. Everybody fell out of the habit of looking ambitiously at transmission expansion. So there's a lot of elements to that. And they are starting to change, but they involve, sometimes we call them the 3 Ps: planning, permitting, and paying.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to do all those 3 things to get a line built. And paying there means allocating, deciding who pays. There's a very particular meaning to that, because the lines are regulated, and there isn't a problem financing them once you decide who will pay for them.
And they're locally regulated. Each state has its regulators. And if you're sending electricity from, let's say, Illinois to Tennessee, you're going through many states who have to agree, especially if you're going to build a power line from there to there. You're going to need lots of sign-offs by the states, but it seemed like in your book that there was something like 20 different federal regulatory agencies who would also have to sign off and do studies and the things. I mean, and I'm wondering whether, ironically, the degree of this regulation that's been presumably did not exist in 1950 that exists today, it was really kind of set up to hinder the growth of dirty energy, and that it's now kind of boomeranging to hurt the ability of clean energy to deliver, let's say, hydroelectric power from Washington State to Tennessee. Well, I guess Tennessee probably has plenty of hydroelectric power. Maybe it's to Arizona.
No, I don't agree with that.
I don't agree with that.
With
Okay.
that narrative at all, Larry. But so let me try to explain. First of all, the regulatory landscape is much more complicated than you laid out, unfortunately, and that is a unique feature of the United States of America. We have the most complicated electric regulatory landscape by far of any developed country, and that does make it harder to transform the whole system. But the landscape looks like this. First of all, building is very different than operating the markets and regulating kind of the operation of the utility. Building new lines is state jurisdictional, but not the State Utility Regulatory Commission that we think of. It's sort of state environmental permitting agencies and land use agencies and other agencies like that. And if the line crosses a waterway or any federal land, which almost every significant line will touch federal facilities or federal land in some way, then it also becomes federally jurisdictional. So you need both state and federal permits to build new lines. And that's the permitting part of the 3 Ps that's complicated. And it's complicated in more ways than one. It's complicated because there's many agencies. It's also complicated because you really do have to balance the impact of that line on water quality and biodiversity and the land you're disrupting and the communities that you're disrupting. You have to balance that with the fact that this is necessary to decarbonize.
So, Peter, why can't you use existing poles, power lines, just put on heavier duty wires? Why is that not possible? What about underground, putting things underground, putting things underwater, down in Mississippi, for example? What about those ideas?
Well, let's take them one at a time. First of all, using current corridors more intensively. I mentioned that we can do some of that even without putting new wires on the lines. We can get additional capacity through them, and we're starting to. The FERC's taken some measures of that. There's new technologies that we're looking at Energy Impact Partners. And so we're starting to do that. You often can't put, can't just pop new higher voltage wires on the existing towers and the existing rights of way, because the higher the voltage, the stronger the tower needs to be. Sometimes it needs to be taller. Sometimes the right of way needs to be wider. And if these right of ways have been there for a long time in urban areas, you can't just push out into the adjoining properties. So there's some things you can do, but there's also places that you need new corridors. Also, keep in mind, Larry, that part of the whole transformation of the system is that we built power lines primarily to coal and other large-scale fossil and nuclear plants, and the lines went from them, in a sense, to the cities. now we need lines to places where there's dozens of wind farms. That's a different part of the country or different places within the state. So we need new routings of lines. So that gets to the first question. As far as undergrounding goes, it's much more expensive than building over land. And we tend to think of undergrounding as a perfect solution. Again, it's not a silver bullet. There are definitely some places where we can use railroad rights of way which are kind of already there and ready for trenching. But it's not going to be a silver bullet, in part because railroads weren't built to go to where wind farms are. They were built to go, again, between cities. So that's partly a solution. And as far as going under sea and under rivers, we're doing that quite frequently now. And in particular with offshore wind, you have the cables from offshore wind going under the seabed until they hit land. And when they hit land, they need to come up onto land. So
are you optimistic? So getting to kind of the first part of the book, you're saying we're going to need potentially twice as much electricity. We're going to need these modern heavy duty power lines. We have all this bureaucratic these obstacles in the way. Where do you come down? Do you think we can make this happen? Can we?
Well, things are starting to change. Back in those decades when we were building out the system, we would do national transmission plans and regional transmission plans. And really, those are both important planning steps. We now, for probably at least 30 years, maybe 40, we have stopped doing any sort of national transmission planning.
Really?
And one of the great things in the Infrastructure Act was, at long last, an appropriation to do a national transmission study, which I believe the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is working on right now.
Cool.
Now, I'm not saying that this plan is going to be the be all and end all. I've been around too long for that. I pretty much guarantee that won't be the case, but it will get the conversation going about the fact that we need to think as a country about the fact that we need more transmission and where we're going to put it. And it moves the discussion forward. We do and have done regional transmission plans, but they have been focused on some much too narrow criteria. My colleague, Hannes Pfeifenberger, has written brilliantly about the need to improve regional transmission planning, because the regional transmission planning we've been doing doesn't take into account the need to move power between regions. It doesn't even often take, believe it or not, decarbonization into account as a kind of fundamental driver of.
So let me make this more concrete. If you think about Texas, isn't it T-Bone Pickens who, maybe I'm mispronouncing his name, who built huge wind farms in Texas? It must have come along with transmission capacity and that didn't exist in Texas. Do you have any stories about successful, at least within state, development of high capacity transmission lines?
Well, sure. Texas is a success story in this particular way. And there's other success stories around the country. California is served by several DC lines that bring hydropower all the way down from Canada, built many decades ago, but really, really important sources of carbon-free energy. So we have managed to build a few large, long lines that have helped decarbonize and will help in the future. What you're referring to in Texas was really a unique and very good undertaking, although it was quite unique to the circumstances in Texas. As you mentioned, T. Boone Pickens and some other large East Texas landowners knew that there was very, very good wind resource there. They went to, I believe it was Governor George W. Bush, and convinced him that the state ought to finance a transmission grid from the east part of Texas, where there's very few people and not very much electricity power demand, to the west, where you have Dallas and Fort Worth and Houston and lots of power demand. Much, by the way, like China, where you have that same east-west divide. And George W. Bush said, that sounds like a good idea. So the state, which has its own power to do the 3 Ps, it permitted this transmission system. Mm-hmm. But first of all, it planned it, then it permitted it, and then it determined who would pay for it. And as a result, it got built, and it was very quickly fully subscribed. It's pretty much full now. And it's definitely a success story in what planners and the industry working together can do to expand the system when they have a will to do it. And in a sense, it is a good model for how we need to think about our grid, because right now, kind of the planning, permitting, paying paradigm, I'm sorry about the onomatopoeia there, is we wait until a wind farm is built and asks permission to get interconnected to the transmission system. It gets in what we call the queue, and then we start building. Now, that's a simplification, but we don't build in advance of having the established contracted facilities there, which means we're always lagging. And that isn't going to move fast enough to decarbonize fully, I don't think, before 2050. And in any case, it's always playing a game of catch up. You're always chasing your tail. Texas didn't do that. And in other parts of the world, they're recognizing you have to plan in advance, because if we do it, decarbonization right, we will need those lines by the time we built them.
Okay, so we're leaving the first part of the book with question marks. We can do this if we try. If we do it the right way. It's not impossible. We did in the past, but we got to move. We got to move quick. And now we come to the second part, which is, how do we move off of carbon and onto renewables in a way that leads to where we have enough storage, because you can't tell the sun to shine. The sun's going to decide when to shine on its own, or the clouds are going to make that decision. So talk to us about the second part of the book, but maybe you could talk for a moment, since you are an engineer, and most people are not, don't have that background, about how the current grid works. If, let's suppose, just as an example, if everybody in Boston decided at the same instant to double their use of electricity, just everybody raised their everybody turned on all the lights they could possibly turn on. Okay, so there's a huge surge of demand for electricity. How is that being met? Does it have to be met actually instantaneously in the system? And how can that actually happen physically because I think this connects to the issue of the need for for storage of energy, of electricity that can then through batteries that I want to talk to you about, which is the second part of your book.
Yeah, let's talk about how a grid operates and then what we'll need for a fully decarbonized grid. Though, in real simple terms, the way a grid operates is that system operators who are sitting in about roughly 100 control centers scattered around the United States, each one controlling, 1/100th of the area of the United States on average. The grid in that area are controlling the power plants, some of the power plants in that area, to instantaneously match the load, that is all of the demand for electricity from everyone in that control area, it's called, match that total demand to all of the power coming from all of the sources, including rooftop solar cells and small and large wind generators and every kind of power plant. They're ensuring that there's an instantaneous match by turning up the power plants that they can control. They don't need to control 100% of the plants because the variation in total demand isn't so much that they need to be turning up every single dial at once. They've been doing this now for a century. They do it 24/7, 365, second by second, and they watch the system evolve. So they have an incredible reliability record. You really shouldn't and can't criticize the industry for doing poorly on reliability. I think we do quite well.
Second by second, it's not people that are second by second. This must be electronically determined, right? Oh,
sure. There's people sitting at the controls, but now this stuff is tremendously assisted by AI-enabled computers, and a lot of the power plants literally automatically, it's called follow the load. So they literally can automatically sense that the load is going up through digital circuitry and get signals to increase, to stay in lockstep with the load up and down. And the way that balance has historically been achieved technically is the subset of power plants that grid controllers control were mainly coal-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants. In other words, it was the fossil-fueled power plants that were the main sources of control. And we had hydroelectric plants, which sometimes are a source of control, but not so much. We have nuclear plants, which are not, they just run. And then we have wind and solar facilities who you can't really turn them up and down. Nature turns them up and down, and they kind of run when they run. So the way grid operators primarily work now is the fossil, and in particularly in the US, the natural gas-fired power plants that we have are the key lever that allows the system to be balanced. And in a sense, decarbonizing the big grid, that's the big part of the grid that we have to build, requires a combination of building more wind and more solar. So we have more of those resources. That means we have to build more transmission so we can connect them. Now, none of this is controllable yet. We need some more controllable sources. And storage is a controllable source. Anything that stores electricity is inherently controllable the same way a fossil fuel power plant's controllable. And in fact, most forms of storage are even more controllable than power plants. They're very nimble. So, and then in addition, the last resource it's just as important as all the other is control over the load in our buildings and factories, because it turns out you can control the load the same way you can control a power plant and balance the system that way. It's called flexible load, and it's a huge resource. My colleague Ryan Fledick estimates 200 gigawatts of flexible load in the United States, which is a fifth of the size of the system. So again, no silver bullet, Larry. We need all of those resources.
This flexible load has not yet been implemented, but you're saying it's there. We can implement it over time.
Well, we have some flexible load. No, it's partly implemented, but nowhere near the potential.
Okay. Now you also
we have some of that flexible load. We usually call it demand response these days, we control load, but not enough to contribute to this full decarbonization high level of balancing that we need.
I see. So now you also talked in the second part about dams being batteries, because you could pump water into water that flows out of the Hoover Dam can be pumped back up, during the day to make electricity, can be pumped back up at night into the dam. And now you have the ability to, that's in effect a battery, this huge dam. You also talked about new types of batteries are being developed that were not lithium based, because I guess the supply of lithium is, and I know that lithium prices have gone by, I think, by a factor of 5 in maybe the last year or so, recent days. But then you also talked about heat batteries, using heating up, I guess salt was, I think, what you talked about, so that whenever it's needed, you can, I guess, produce steam with the heat, and then use that to turn a turbine and produce a generator, produce electricity, and that becomes in effect a battery. So I think, one thing to say in general here is that anybody really wants to understand the future of energy in our country has to be reading Power After Carbon, because you learn so much, and the writing is so good. I mean, this is a book that's full of details, but you don't really get that you're in a class because you've got such a terrific professor. A third of this book is appendices and notes and indices. So, but as you're reading along, you're not interrupted by any of that. But all the details, all the documentation is there. It's just a masterful production by a fantastic writer. Peter, tell us about batteries. Are you up? Is this the upbeat Peter I know, or is this the not so upbeat?
On storage in general, which, as you note, is both electrical, or what we often call batteries, and also thermal. In both cases, I think there's a fantastic technological renaissance going on, that I am optimistic that a combination of new storage technologies, I do think we will get to building more transmission. I think you see the policy shifting, the 3 Ps starting to shift. I think we'll have other controllable generation technologies, like some geothermals are controllable, and I think we'll have new nuclear technologies, and that will be controllable, unlike current generation plants. So I think we will have more flexible load. And so when you combine all of those resources, I am very, very optimistic on us getting to a fully decarbonized energy system by 2050 in developed countries. I'm not at all sanguine about the emerging economies. That's probably a topic for another 2 or 3 podcasts. and also other segments outside the energy system, such as agriculture. But as far as the energy system, I think the combination of all those factors will allow us to fully decarbonize the energy system. And part of that, as I said, was this renaissance in storage technologies, which include everything from large scale batteries that'll be as big as a power plant. Form Energy is a company we've invested in an EIP that uses very low cost materials, basically iron ore, to store energy. It's quite amazing. And so it's very inexpensive. But in addition to that, there's other new large scale storage technologies that don't use lithium. Lithium, by the way, which has gotten cheaper, Larry, lately, will continue, I think, to be, yes, it's come back down, but there's going to be tremendous demand for lithium for car batteries where it really, really suits the technology. And so there will be stress on that supply chain, and it's great to have alternatives to lithium, but lithium batteries continue to get better. And there's many other technologies. Hydrogen storage is being pursued in many different forms. Some of it is compressed hydrogen, some of it, just in tanks and caverns. Some of it is turning hydrogen into ammonia, which can be used in ships as fuel and as an excellent storage medium, and other forms of hydrogen storage. And then there's, as you mentioned, also a renaissance in thermal storage. Another company we've invested in is Rondo, which is basically thermal storage in a new kind of ceramic material. And there's lots of other technology under development, and that's not counting what the Department of Energy and other basic research enterprises are financing in universities like our university, Boston University, where over in the mechanical engineering department, they're using metal lattices with experimenting with, totally new technologies for storing power.
Cool. Okay, so as we're kind of winding down, let's spend the last 5 minutes or so on the third part of the book about, how you see, if you had to, in your ideal world, in 2050 or 2070, Peter Fox Penner is the dictator and can determine exactly how things evolve. We have power lines, we've cut through all the red tape, we have all kinds of storage technologies have come on. How do you see the private public kind of mix here of deliverance of energy to the ultimate end user? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the main point of the last part.
Well, first of all, were I ever to be the dictator of the energy system, I would first max out energy efficiency and local generation first, and then I would move on to lines, but I'm sure we'll need them. Second of all, as you've said, the third part of the book is about the industry's business model, and particularly the utility business model. I continue to think that regulated utilities are at the core of the new energy ecosystem, particularly the new electricity ecosystem. They've been the core from the start, but I think they will continue to be the core. And what I ask in the third part of the book is, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of business model? They're going to be there. They're going to almost certainly own the local delivery lines and lots of important switchgear and those control centers, and play a role in reliability and so on and so forth. But what's their business? What do they sell? And how do they do it? And I think there's two business models that we look at, that I look at. One of them is kind of a platform, sort of like iPhones, where app developers can put their apps and sell through to the customers. So in this context, that's independent, unregulated sellers of electricity and demand response, flexible load, and car charging services and things like that, selling through to customers. And the utility is kind of it's a market maker. It's a platform. It delivers. It's the physical delivery platform, but it also is the financial intermediary, which is very much like your iPhone. Your iPhone is literally the technological delivery medium, but it's also, you have to pay for that app through the iPhone, and it's the financial marketplace. That's one model. The other model is a little more traditional, where the utility kind of does the bundling on behalf of consumers. That's sort of what utilities originally did, but the only thing they bundled was different power plants together, and it was all supply. And then energy efficiency was added a little bit to their mission. And now I think you could see utilities really putting this much richer palette of services, some helping to manage car charging, managing your smart home services, controlling the voltage on the system locally, doing flexible load, delivering the kilowatt hours, and so on. And I think both models are moving forward, because I think in lots of places, even sophisticated customers, like I would like to think of myself as a pretty sophisticated electricity customer, I hope so, it gets pretty complicated to buy all of these things a la carte when there's a lot of synergies in putting them together. And I could probably figure that out, but even I sometimes like to buy in kind of one-stop shopping. That's the idea. So utilities may have a role even in this more richer, more variegated future of being kind of I call them energy service utilities, where they bundle these services and deliver them at cost-based rates, which is what we have now. So their profits, they're allowed to earn a reasonable profit, but not an excessive profit. And that model, I think, has worked pretty well, and will continue with some performance targets that are very, very important there.
Well, let me end with one last question for you, and then feel free to make any sales pitch for the book if you like. But so we've had the infrastructure bill, and we've had the Inflation Reduction Act. The president is touting, and I think a lot of people who are concerned about climate change are saying that these bills have made, are going to make a huge difference to America's response to climate change. And we're certainly responsible for a huge amount of the carbon that's in the atmosphere that's going to be impacting our kids and grandkids for many, many decades. So how do you view these pieces of legislation? Do you see them as making a material difference, or is there going to be more kind of commercially driven as the price of clean energy comes down, that the world is just going to change intrinsically due to competition, that coal plants are not being built in the U.S. because they're just not commercially viable? Maybe that's due to regulation in part, but tell us how you view these new pieces of these new bills and the actual government role going forward.
Well, first of all, the new bills are very, very significant. There's some good research that basically shows, with pretty extensive modeling, that these bills alone, and they are the largest, by far the largest single climate enactment in the country's history, and they by themselves will close half the gap to net zero by 2050. And I think those those well could be underestimates, but those are pretty, I think, reasonable projections. So government policies are very, very essential, but particularly in the United States, and particularly in energy policy, it's definitely not either or, Larry. A lot of what we do in energy policy is enable markets to move faster. That's and that includes the markets for innovation, where Energy Impact Partners operates. That's venture capital and private equity, which has been helped by these acts. They're supporting directly some of our companies and other companies in the space, and they're creating a climate that makes financing easier. Mm-hmm. They're also enabling, by de-risking some of that kind of valley of death when technologies have to scale up, and there's a lot of risk in those first couple of large-scale pilots. It's a fantastic and very important role for government to play, because once you get through proving out those technologies, the market is ready to take over. And you can then turn it over to the marketplace. And I think there's quite a lot of investment capital that is ready out on the sidelines or even in the marketplace now, looking for technologies once they've established that they work. So there are lots of ways in which government policies enable and accelerate markets. And there is no way that government alone, particularly in the United States, could decarbonize the power grid. It's going to take $2.5 trillion by most estimates in that ballpark. And there's no reason why all of that has to be publicly raised and spent capital. Absolutely no reason. But by that same token, there is no way that the private sector can raise and spend that money without collaborative government policies on things like R&D, de-risking technology, transmission, some of the things that are truly and fundamentally public goods and public roles.
Cool. Peter, brilliant conversation. Here's the book. Any one sentence or a couple sentence pitch besides read this book?
You've been very, very kind about the book. I hope, I want to say to your viewers and listeners, I hope this has been helpful to them in some small way, and Happy New Year. And we thank you, Larry, for letting me talk with you at this level of depth. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Fantastic book. Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year to all listeners. And let's go for power after carbon. Okay. Take care.
Thanks.